My name is Emily Gonzalez. I'm 39 years old, and 1 week ago, the man I spent more than a decade loving told me that I had been holding him back. It was said with a calmness so casual that it almost felt rehearsed, as if he had been practicing the line for months. But to understand how everything spiraled into a breakup, lawyers, and an invoice worth nearly $100,000, you need to know the part of the story that came first, the part where I believed that supporting someone meant giving them every resource you had without asking them for anything in return. 2 years ago, my boyfriend Anthony Rivera decided he wanted to open his own boutique clothing store. He had been working part-time as a buyer for a department store. The job was fine, nothing glamorous, but stable. Still, Anthony wanted more. He wanted something that felt personal and meaningful. This store will be my legacy, he told me. Something that finally feels like mine. I supported him completely. That wasn't a difficult decision. When you're in love, it feels natural to root for the other person's dreams, even when the numbers on the spreadsheet make your stomach tighten. He calculated that he needed about $75,000 to get everything started, first-year lease and deposit inventory renovations, marketing, licensing. We sat at the kitchen table, night after night, going through every line item. I had around $40,000 saved for a future down payment on a bigger home. I suggested applying for a small business loan for the rest. Anthony immediately rejected the idea, saying debt would limit his creativity and make him too anxious to think straight. I didn't want him drowning in anxiety, so I convinced myself that I could shoulder the burden instead. I liquidated some investments, accepted the penalty for pulling from my retirement account, borrowed $15,000 from my parents, and pieced together enough to help him open the store in March. It should have been exciting, and at first it was. But by June, he needed an additional $12,000 for unexpected inventory issues. I took on a consulting side job on weekends to help cover it and paid my parents back slowly, month after month. But the store never found its footing. Anthony blamed the location, the one he insisted was perfect, then the economy, then the customers, then society at large for not valuing craftsmanship. And somehow, gradually, without me even realizing it, the frustrations he had with the store began turning into frustrations he had with me. If I suggested a pricing adjustment or a promotional sale, he accused me of trying to control his business. If I didn't say anything at all, he accused me of being emotionally absent and unsupportive. It didn't matter what I did. I was always the problem. By last September, the store had bled itself dry. Anthony closed it permanently. It was a complete and painful financial loss, but I never said I told you so. I tried to be the calm one, the steady one. I told him we would rebuild. I told him he wasn't a failure. I told him dreams don't always succeed the first time. Last week, he came home late from dinner with friends. He seemed strange, quiet, almost rehearsed. When I asked if everything was okay, he snapped, "No, Emily. It's not okay. I'm suffocating in this relationship." I genuinely thought I misheard him. But he kept going, telling me I never believed in him, that I threw money at his dream because it was easier than being emotionally supportive, that I secretly wanted him to fail to boost my own sense of control. It was so absurd that for a moment I could only stare at him. Then he said he wanted space. He wanted a separation. He needed to find himself, and somehow I had become the obstacle. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I simply said, "You're right. I should step aside." He looked surprised that I didn't fight him. 2 days later, he moved in with his sister and handed me the name of his lawyer, clearly prepared for a drawn-out confrontation. The morning after he left, I sat at my dining table and felt the grief collapse into something sharper. I opened my computer, pulled bank statements, created spreadsheets, and totaled everything I had given him. $87, $340 in total, not including the loss of retirement growth or the penalties I had paid. Then I calculated 5% annual interest, a conservative rate for a business loan. The final number came to $94,683. I drafted a formal invoice. I itemized every contribution. I attached receipts, bank transfers, screenshots of texts. My paralegal friend helped me format it into something that looked like it came from a corporate accounting department. Then I sent it to Anthony and his lawyer with the subject line, "Outstanding business investment repayment required." 30 minutes later, Anthony's lawyer emailed back asking if I was serious. I replied, "Absolutely serious." By the next day, the situation had already escalated. His lawyer claimed the funds were gifts between romantic partners, accused me of being vindictive and cruel, and insisted the invoice was unenforceable. What Anthony and his lawyer didn't realize was that I had kept every text message. For 2 years, he had asked for money while using the words, "loan investment, and I'll pay you back countless times." And that was when I felt the shift, the moment when heartbreak turned into clarity. I realized I wasn't the villain in his story. I was just the first person to hold him accountable. The morning after I sent the invoice, my phone buzzed relentlessly. Calls from Anthony's family, messages from mutual friends, emails from his lawyer. It was as if all of them had rehearsed the same chorus. How could you do this to him? How could you demand repayment after everything he's been through? Not one of them asked what I had been through or what I had sacrificed. To them, Anthony was the wounded artist whose spirit had been crushed by my cold financial retaliation, as if I hadn't spent years giving him every ounce of stability I had. His lawyer's official response arrived that afternoon. The letter was 2 pages long and written in the most condescending tone imaginable, describing my invoice as vindictive, emotionally charged, and legally unenforceable. According to him, everything I contributed had been a gift given freely within a committed relationship, and my request for repayment was an attempt to financially abuse a vulnerable client during a difficult emotional period. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so insulting. I forwarded the email to my lawyer the best I could afford on short notice and waited. She didn't take long. "We need evidence. These were loans, not gifts," she said. "Anything written, anything that mentions repayment." I nearly laughed. Evidence. I had so much evidence it bordered on embarrassing. I opened a folder I'd created and dragged in dozens of screenshots, messages with timestamps, bank transfers with captions from Anthony, even voice memos where he apologized for asking for another loan. My lawyer's tone shifted the moment she read them. These aren't vague promises. He uses the word loan explicitly, repeatedly. This is extremely helpful. She sent a reply to Anthony's lawyer within an hour. It was short, sharp, and laced with steel. "Please provide evidence that the funds were gifted. Our client maintains that all contributions were loans or business investments, as contemporaneous written communications clearly indicate. Attached are 27 such communications." That was the first crack in Anthony's side. Later that evening, while gathering documents for my lawyer, I found something else, something I hadn't been looking for. The business account was in Anthony's name, only something he insisted on early on so that he could maintain complete creative control. Even though I funded nearly everything, he was the sole owner of the business entity. He said it kept things clean, legally speaking. I had access only because the paper statements had been mailed to our house. When I opened the box, I expected to see the usual expenses inventory orders, vendor payments, marketing fees. I was prepared for financial chaos, but not for what I actually saw. Right there, highlighted in the monthly summaries, were over $23,000 in business expenses that had nothing to do with the store. Charges from a spa. I had never heard of restaurants. He never took me to a hotel. I knew we had never stayed in thousands in cash. Withdrawals, jewelry stores, and charges at boutiques I didn't recognize. Every line item felt heavier than the last. These weren't mistakes or miscalculations. They were decisions, intentional ones, and all of them made behind my back with money I'd pulled from my future. I forwarded the questionable expenses to my lawyer without comment. Her reply came minutes later. "Oh, this is very relevant, especially if he claims financial hardship or emotional distress." That was the moment something in me solidified. I wasn't going to be guilt-tripped. I wasn't going to be shamed, and I certainly wasn't going to let him get away with rewriting the story to make himself a victim. Not long after the phone calls started, first Anthony's sister. "How dare you bill him like some creditor," she snapped. "He pursued his dreams. You should be proud, not cruel." I told her that Anthony had repeatedly called the money a loan and promised repayment once the store succeeded. She told me that was semantics, that couples didn't nitpick money like that. When I reminded her I'd taken a retirement penalty and borrowed from my parents, she simply said, "Well, that was your choice," and hung up. Then his mother called, sobbing so loudly I could barely understand her. She said Anthony was devastated, depressed, emotionally crushed. She said I was ruining him financially when he was already at his lowest. I reminded her it was Anthony who asked for the separation. Her response was, "He only did that because he felt unsupported. You pushed him to the edge." I ended the call before the conversation could get uglier. Even my own parents called. My dad was careful, trying to understand the situation, but my mom was emotional. "Honey, we gave you that $15,000 because we believed in both of you. We didn't want it back." I explained that I wasn't asking for it back from them. I was asking Anthony to repay me so I could repay them. "This is going to get messy," my mother warned. "It already is," I said. The next day, a mutual friend reached out. He wanted to check in, but it quickly became clear he was calling on Anthony's behalf. "He's really upset," the friend said. "He told us you're trying to bankrupt him." I asked if Anthony also mentioned the $87,000 I gave him. Silence. Then the friend muttered, "Well, he said you were supposed to be partners, that you handled the finances together." I exhaled slowly, holding back anger. "I funded 100% of the business," I said. "He kept 100% of the control, and now 100% of it is gone. How is that a partnership?" The friend didn't have an answer. The legal back and forth intensified quickly. Anthony's lawyer attempted to negotiate a reasonable compromise repayment of $80,000 with zero interest, spread out over a laughable $500 per month, which would take more than 13 years to complete. My lawyer rejected the offer in less than 5 minutes and added a line Anthony's attorney clearly didn't expect. "We are fully prepared to proceed with discovery regarding misappropriated business funds." That was the moment everything changed. Anthony's side had no idea we'd already found the suspicious charges. They didn't know I had the account statements. They didn't know I had itemized every questionable expense. His lawyer went from aggressive to suddenly cautious. What none of them understood was that I had reached my breaking point. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the truth. For the first time in our entire relationship, I wasn't letting Anthony control the narrative. I wasn't cushioning his ego. I wasn't sacrificing myself so he could feel supported. I was standing my ground, and I was finally holding him accountable. And I could feel it even then. This fight was about to reveal far more than either of us expected. The moment Anthony's lawyer realized we weren't bluffing about the business expenses, everything shifted. His tone changed from dismissive to strangely formal, as if he finally understood this wasn't just an emotional breakup, this was a financial investigation with teeth. Within days, my lawyer filed a formal civil suit for repayment, which automatically triggered discovery, meaning both sides were legally required to hand over all documents related to the business. This was the part of the process Anthony clearly hadn't anticipated. Discovery meant full transparency. Receipts, bank statements, credit card charges, vendor records, everything. Anthony had never allowed me access to the business credit card. In the beginning, he'd said it was because he wanted to track everything himself and keep finances organized. Later, he insisted he needed complete control to stay focused creatively. I didn't push at the time. I thought it was just a quirk of being an entrepreneur. Now I understood it for what it really was, concealment. When the first batch of documents came in, my lawyer called me immediately. "Emily, you need to come to the office. There's more than we expected." I drove there with a tightness in my chest, half furious, half afraid of what I would find. I braced myself for bad bookkeeping, maybe some foolish impulse buys he tried to pass off as business expenses. But as we spread the statements across the conference table, my stomach dropped. There were $34,000 in charges on the business credit card I had never seen before. While some were legitimate inventory shipping fabric orders, others were glaringly personal. Luxury hotels, high-end restaurants, jewelry stores, concert tickets, spa services, boutiques that specialized in women's clothing. I stared at the items in disbelief. "He didn't even try to hide it," I whispered. "He charged all of this to the business." My lawyer was calm but firm. "Not only that, but the dates on these charges matter. Look here." She slid 2 statements toward me. "These hotel stays happened on weekends. You told me you were working your second consulting job. Every single one. And this jewelry purchase, you said you've never seen it." "I haven't," I said, voice tightening. "He never gave me jewelry." Something cold and heavy settled in my stomach. I remembered the restaurant bills we rarely matched to date nights, the mysterious cash withdrawals, the nights he came home late and insisted he'd been at networking events. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces I had tried so hard not to assemble locked into place, and someone else's outline, someone whose presence I had always felt but never identified, slowly sharpened. My lawyer cross-referenced the dates with my calendar exactly as the original story required. Each suspicious charge aligned perfectly with weekends I was gone or busy. Nothing lined up with our shared life. Every sign pointed to a pattern, and patterns don't lie. The next step was Anthony's deposition. This was separate from the civil suit, but happening in parallel because he had retained legal representation for our separation as well. I had never been in a deposition before. The room was sterile and cold, with a long table dividing the two sides. Anthony sat across from me, looking exhausted and irritated, but still holding that wounded artist demeanor he used whenever he felt scrutinized. His lawyer tried to appear confident, but I could tell from the stiffness in his jaw that he was uneasy. My lawyer began calmly. "Mr. Rivera, can you explain the charges at the Emerson Hotel on May 14th of last year?" Anthony cleared his throat. "That was a business networking event. Stayed overnight." She slid a printed statement toward him. "This shows room service for 2 champagne and a late checkout." "Who was the second guest?" He hesitated. "A colleague. Male or female?" His lawyer objected instantly, but the damage was already done. Anthony's face was a shade too red, his voice too unsteady. My lawyer didn't push the question, but she didn't need to. The insinuation was already hanging thick in the air. Next came the jewelry purchases. "Can you tell us the purpose of the $3,800 charge at Avellino Jewelers?" "It was a gift." "For whom?" "It doesn't matter," he snapped. "It was for business." "No one buys jewelry for business," my lawyer said, her voice cool and even. "Please answer the question." Anthony swallowed. "It was for a friend." "Not for me, not for anyone I knew. A friend." The judge overseeing the discovery process stepped in toward the end, reviewing the text where Anthony used words like loan, investment, repayment, and "I promise I'll return every penny." She lifted her eyes to Anthony and asked, "Did you intend to repay these funds?" He stammered, "I intended for the business to succeed, so we would both benefit." "That is not what I asked," the judge cut in. "Did you intend to repay her the money you requested?" His eyes started to water, not from heartbreak, but from the pressure of being cornered. His lawyer called for a recess. When they stepped outside, Anthony looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under him. During the break, my lawyer leaned toward me and whispered, "They're going to settle. This is going very badly for them." She was right. When we resumed, Anthony's lawyer presented a newly softened tone and proposed a repayment plan. $45,000 over 5 years at $750 per month in exchange for dropping the interest and halting any further investigation into business expenses. My lawyer immediately countered $70,000 over 3 years, threatening full discovery of financial misappropriation if they refused. They tried to negotiate down, but the evidence was too damning. Eventually, they landed at $65,000 over 4 years, which my lawyer recommended I accept, but only if there was an automatic acceleration clause if he defaulted on even one payment. They reluctantly agreed. The settlement wasn't perfect. It didn't cover everything I had lost, but it was a victory, one grounded in reality and backed by the truth. I had protected myself not emotionally, but legally, and that mattered. But the most devastating twist hadn't surfaced yet. It came a week later from someone who never should have known the details, and yet somehow knew everything. A mutual friend. The one who said he probably shouldn't say anything. And with one sentence, he changed the whole story. Emily. Anthony was seeing someone. For a while. Long before the breakup. Everything inside me went still. For a long moment after hearing the words come out of our mutual friend's mouth, I couldn't react at all. It wasn't shock implies surprise. This felt more like confirmation, like a truth that had been sitting in my peripheral vision for months, waiting for me to finally look directly at it. "Who?" I asked quietly. He swallowed, clearly uncomfortable. "His ex. The woman who helped with the store's website. They reconnected. I guess sometime early last year." I didn't need a calendar to know what that meant. Early last year was exactly when the first suspicious credit card charges had appeared. The hotel weekends that didn't include me. The dinners I was never invited to. The jewelry I never saw. The boutique purchases that never made their way into our house. Every lie Anthony told suddenly had a timestamp, and every missing piece of the financial puzzle rearranged itself into a painfully coherent story. He had been using my money to romance another woman. My breath caught, but I didn't break. Maybe because part of me had expected this. Maybe because betrayal, when it finally arrives in full clarity, is almost too heavy to feel all at once. The friend kept rambling nervously, explaining that Anthony had been seen with her at events, that they had dinner together often, that he had overheard something about Anthony needing space long before Anthony ever said the words to my face. I listened, but my mind was already miles away. I remembered every moment Anthony claimed I was suffocating him, every accusation that I wasn't supportive enough, every time he'd looked at me like I had stolen something from him when in reality, he'd been stealing from me my savings, my trust, my dignity for months. Later that day, I sat down with my lawyer and told her everything. She listened carefully, her expression measured. When I finished, she said, "Legally, we can attempt to reopen discovery and pursue fraud, depending on how the misappropriated funds were presented during the settlement negotiations. But you need to understand this will be expensive, stressful, and could take months, even years." I knew she was right. I also knew that I had already lost enough time, money, and pieces of myself to Anthony's choices. The certainty of that decision washed over me like cold water. "No," I said. "I don't want to go after anything else. I'm done." Something shifted when I said those words out loud. It wasn't weakness, it was release. The separation agreement was finalized soon after. Even though we weren't married, years of shared finances, cohabitation, and commingled expenses meant the settlement process resembled a divorce in many ways. I lost some assets because of how the laws around long-term partnerships work. I ended up buying out our shared property interest at a painful cost. Anthony, in return, got certain items, portions of the savings account, and a few financial concessions my lawyer said were expected in cases like this. But the most important piece remained intact: the civil judgment for the $65,000 repayment over 4 years. No matter what else I lost, that obligation, the money he took from me and promised to repay, was secured. Still, even with the legal clarity, the emotional aftermath hit differently now that I knew about the affair. There was grief, yes, but not for Anthony. It was grief for myself, for the version of me who poured everything into a man who had already started checking out. For the woman who worked weekends to carry a business that was funding someone else's dinners. For the partner who bent over backwards trying to keep a relationship alive while he used my loyalty as a safety net for his betrayal. For days after the settlement, I went through the motions of daily life. I cooked because I had to. I worked because I needed to. I slept because exhaustion pulled me under every night. But emotionally, I felt detached from everything. I was navigating the world on autopilot, my mind still replaying every moment with Anthony through this new lens. It was a week later when one specific memory resurfaced, the night Anthony came home late after a networking event, smelling faintly of cologne he never wore. Back then, he brushed it off as someone hugging him goodbye. Now I realized that the woman wearing that scent wasn't a stranger. I didn't know her name, but I remembered feeling something uneasy that night, something I pushed away to avoid conflict. I had trusted him. He had relied on that trust. I asked my lawyer one last time whether pursuing fraud would change anything significant. She shook her head gently. "You've already secured the major victory. Even if you win a fraud case, it could cost you tens of thousands more in legal fees, and you might not recover much beyond what you already got. The process would be brutal." That was enough. I wasn't going to let Anthony keep draining me. The truth was already out. I didn't need a judge to confirm what everyone could see. Anthony had ruined his own credibility with his actions. He had sabotaged the business, the relationship, and his own future. The repayment plan was secured. The story was exposed. There was nothing left in him worth fighting for. A few days later, the mutual friend called again, not to gossip, but to apologize. He said I didn't know. I swear I didn't. I thought he was stressed, not cheating. If I'd known what he was doing with the money, I would have told you sooner. He paused, then added quietly, "He's moved in with her now." 2 weeks after the settlement. I should have felt anger, but I didn't. I should have felt vindicated, but I didn't. All I felt was confirmation. Anthony wasn't complicated. He wasn't searching for himself. He wasn't broken or misunderstood. He was simply someone who didn't value what he had, who used people until they ran dry, and who justified every selfish decision as a consequence of being unsupported. The truth had cost me money, time, and years of emotional labor, but the truth also freed me. I didn't have to carry the weight of his failures anymore, or his manipulations, or the fantasy I'd built around him. His life was no longer my responsibility. For the first time in years, I could finally see my future without him in it, and it didn't scare me. 2 months after the settlement, the dust finally began to settle. Not dramatically, not all at once more, like the way a storm leaves behind. Silence, the air still heavy but breathable again. I had expected to feel triumphant or bitter or conflicted when everything was finalized. Instead, what I felt was a quiet, steady relief. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't closure, not fully. It was simply the realization that I could finally live without waiting for the next explosion. Anthony made his first repayment on the 15th of the month, $1,350, withdrawn automatically through the court-ordered system. I saw the transfer notification, watched it land in my account, and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no surge of vindication. Just neutrality. A mechanical exchange of numbers, representing a debt he owed, a debt he created, and a debt he would carry for the next 4 years. In a way, that absence of feeling was its own kind of healing. I didn't need the payment to feel powerful. I didn't need vengeance. I just needed distance. The house felt different without him. At first, it was unsettling spaces left open, where his things used to be closets that suddenly seemed larger silence that wasn't filled by his restless pacing or defensive explanations. But once I began reclaiming the rooms, the silence became intentional, almost comforting. I took down the decor he insisted matched his aesthetic vision, repainted the bedroom walls, and bought a new couch I actually liked. Slowly, the house stopped feeling like a shared life and started feeling like a life that was finally mine. Work also changed. A month after everything ended, I was promoted to a senior operations role. More responsibility, more recognition, and a raise substantial enough to make rebuilding my savings feel possible again. My boss said the promotion had been in discussion for months. I wondered if I would have even accepted it back when I was still exhausted from working extra jobs to support Anthony's store. Now I stepped into the role with clarity and focus I hadn't felt in years. My parents were relieved once I told them the legal battles were over. My dad told me quietly but firmly that he was proud of how I had handled everything, that I stayed rational when it counted, that I didn't let manipulation drag me under. My mom hugged me and whispered, "You deserve someone who builds with you, not on you." For the first time since all of this began, I believed her. Mutual friends reacted predictably. Some had gone quiet during the chaos and remained quiet afterward, embarrassed by the assumptions they had made. Others reached out privately to apologize, saying they had no idea how much I had funded, how many promises Anthony had made, or how much he had twisted the narrative. A few admitted that once the truth about the business expenses got around, their sympathy for him evaporated. They weren't angry at him for failing. Everyone fails, but for lying so easily, so convincingly to people who had supported him. His family, on the other hand, stayed loyal to him. His sister refused to speak to me. His mom sent one curt email saying, "I hope you're happy now." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. News traveled faster than I expected. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned that Anthony had moved in with his ex, the same woman he'd been seeing while the business was collapsing. Apparently, several people in their friend circle were distancing themselves from the relationship, either because they felt betrayed by his behavior or because they didn't want to be associated with the drama. People might tolerate failure, but they rarely respect deceit. But none of that mattered to me anymore. Their judgments weren't my responsibility. Anthony's new life wasn't my concern. And his relationship, now built openly instead of in secret hotel rooms, no longer had the power to affect me. I started therapy around that time, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand the deeper wound, the part of me that had tolerated so much for so long. My therapist told me something that stayed with me. The betrayal wasn't just the cheating. It was how he made you question your judgment, your support, your reality. Gaslighting leaves bruises no one else sees. That truth hit harder than any hotel charge ever could. Yes, the affair hurt. Yes, the financial loss stung. But the most painful part was remembering how he had stood in front of me and told me I was unsupportive while using my savings to support someone else. How he portrayed me as the villain when all I ever did was build a safety net for his dream. How he turned my sacrifices into weapons against me. Yet as the weeks passed, I no longer felt consumed by those memories. I was building something new slowly but deliberately. I was reclaiming my time, my space, my sense of self. I even went on a few casual dates. Nothing serious, nothing rushed, just stretching the muscles of possibility again. My therapist said it was normal to feel hesitation, that trust once broken, that deeply takes time to rebuild even in yourself. But there was one thing I did trust: consequences. Every month at exactly 12:01 p.m. on the 15th, $1, 350 eyes arrived in my account. Not out of love or remorse or duty, but because a court order required it, because truth had consequences, because accountability, even delayed, was still accountability. Every time that notification appeared, I didn't think of Anthony. I thought of the moment I drew a line that said, "I will not be manipulated. I will not be blamed for your failures. I will not lose everything because you refuse to face the truth." It wasn't revenge. It wasn't vindictive. It was simply justice. In the end, justice didn't look like winning everything. It looked like refusing to lose everything. It looked like letting go of a man who used me, rebuilding my life piece by piece, and remembering that loyalty should never cost you your future. Anthony's repayment wasn't closure. It wasn't victory. It was just a reminder, a small monthly echo of the truth I refused to ignore. And that I realized was enough. My name is Sandra Baker. I'm 37 years old, and here's how my story begins. If you asked anyone who knew us back then, they would have said my husband and I were a solid couple, practical, steady, the kind of pair who showed up to dinner parties with matching sweaters and a well-rehearsed laugh. I was 37, he was 34. We'd met at a friend's wedding, danced to 3 slow songs, talked until sunrise, and convinced ourselves destiny had tapped us on the shoulder. We married 2 years later in a ceremony so small you could count the guests without running out of fingers. Nothing extravagant, no ice sculpture, no rented ballroom, no fireworks display timed to our first kiss as husband and wife. Just the two of us under an oak tree, our families on mismatched chairs, and a promise to build a life together. I genuinely believe that was enough. For years it was, or at least I thought it was, Elias. My husband always liked nice things. He appreciated quality, as he put it. But something shifted about 18 months ago. Not suddenly, not dramatically, more like a slow leak in the foundation. Quiet, subtle, but undeniably corrosive. It started when his college friend Brian married a woman whose family practically printed money. Their Instagram was a highlight reel of yacht vacations, rooftop champagne nights, and weekend getaways that cost more than my car. Elias would scroll through his phone with this distant look in his eyes, like he was watching a life meant for someone else. "Did you see this?" he asked one night, shoving the screen at me. The newlyweds were in Japan for cherry blossom season, wearing matching designer coats. "Must be nice, right? Just deciding to go to Tokyo because you're bored." I laughed it off. "We went to Cabo in March. That was pretty nice." He didn't laugh. He didn't even look at me. It only got worse from there. Every dinner with friends, every casual conversation, every post on social media seemed to magnify what we didn't have. The comparisons crept in like cracks in glass. One night, after I got home from a long day of client meetings, I found him sitting at the kitchen island, hunched over his phone. The glow lit up his face, highlighting the tightness around his mouth. I'd seen that look before in sales executives who realize someone half their age just outperformed them in people who feel the world owes them more. "We should go to the Maldives," he said without glancing up. I froze halfway to the fridge. "Maybe next year. Once that bonus comes in, we can—" "Next year," he repeated, finally lifting his eyes to mine. "It's always next year with you, isn't it?" "We just went to Mexico in March," I said softly. He scoffed, actually scoffed. Mexico Brian and his wife just spent 2 weeks in Italy. Private vineyard tours, first-class flights. Real vacations, not budget getaways. That word budget hit harder than it should have. I wasn't ashamed of our life. I'd built my career from nothing, worked through nights and weekends, clawed my way into a stable, comfortable income. But suddenly comfortable wasn't enough for him. "I'm not a hedge fund baby," I said quietly. "You knew that when you married me." That's when his expression changed. Cold. Flat. Contemptuous. "I did know that," he said. "And I'm tired, Sandra. Tired of settling. Tired of your mediocre income and your mediocre ambitions." I felt something deep inside me tilt like the floor had shifted under my feet. He stood up slowly, deliberately. "You can't provide the life I want," he said. "Then stay out of my way. I'll find someone who can." Every word landed like a shard of ice. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Not because he'd said something cruel. People say cruel things when they are angry. But because he meant it. I saw the truth in his eyes, the truth he might have been hiding even from himself. He didn't see me as his partner anymore. He saw me as an obstacle, I set down the folder of reports I'd been carrying, suddenly aware of how heavy everything felt. The silence, the disappointment, the years of pouring myself into a marriage that now felt paper thin. "Are you serious?" I whispered. "Dead serious," he snapped. "I'm not spending the rest of my life pinching pennies while everyone else lives actual lives. Step up or step aside." Something inside me clicked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, precise click like a lock turning. All the pleading, the performing, the accommodating evaporated. "Good luck with that," I said. He blinked, thrown off. He'd expected tears, a breakdown, a desperate scramble to win him back. He didn't know me as well as he thought. I walked past him to our home office, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a file I had prayed I'd never need. My uncle, an attorney who'd seen too many marriages implode, insisted on a prenup before I married Elias. He'd said it was protection, not mistrust. A safety net for the life I'd built before Elias ever walked into it. Elias had signed it with barely a skim too excited about the wedding to care about paperwork. I dialed my attorney. "It's time," I said. By the time Elias came to bed that night, divorce papers were already being drafted. The next morning, I handed him a coffee and a crisp white business card. He stared at it confused. "What's this?" "My lawyer," I said gently. "We're done. They'll contact yours. Or you can get your own." His confusion morphed into shock, then outrage. "You're divorcing me over one argument." "No," I said. "I'm divorcing you because you told me I'm not enough and that you want someone richer. I'm simply giving you what you asked for." "You're being dramatic," he snapped. "You're really throwing away 6 years because I was frustrated." "You told me to step aside," I said, picking up my keys. "So I'm stepping aside permanently." "You can't just—" "I can," I said, and I have. I walked out the door without looking back. My phone buzzed non-stop on the drive to work. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He'd already said everything I needed to hear. Elias didn't respond to the divorce news the way I once imagined he would. Instead of showing remorse or even desperation, he hired an attorney who advertised himself as aggressive on a website littered with stock photos of gavels and city skylines. It felt almost absurd watching him posture as if he were the one being wronged. He texted constantly in the days that followed, accusations, pleas, guilt trips, attempts to regain control through sheer persistence. I responded just once to tell him all communication must go through attorneys. After that, I ignored the stream of messages ranging from, "You're being dramatic," to, "You owe me a chance to explain." When he realized I wouldn't engage, his mother stepped in, leaving a voicemail that sounded like it had been practiced in front of a mirror. She lectured me about commitment, accused me of taking marriage too lightly, and insisted I was throwing away something beautiful over emotions. I deleted it without listening to the end. 2 days later, his sister appeared unannounced at my office building, demanding I fix the rift I supposedly created. She caused such a scene that security had to escort her out, and even then she tried to twist back toward me with accusations about loyalty and betrayal. I remember sitting at my desk afterward, the fluorescent light buzzing faintly above me, wondering when Elias's entire family had agreed to speak in a single vocabulary: deny, deflect, dismiss, blame. They had perfected the skill long before I entered their lives. I had simply been naive enough to overlook it. 2 weeks later, the mediation date arrived. I dressed simply and professionally, slacks, a fitted blazer, my hair pinned back in a way that made me feel focused rather than defensive. When I walked into the room, Elias was already seated beside his attorney. He looked tired, eyes red-rimmed, as if exhaustion had etched itself into the lines of his face. For a split second, I saw the man I once loved, the man who danced with me, under strings of lights at a wedding reception, and whispered promises about a life built on teamwork and trust. But that flicker vanished the moment he straightened his posture, lifting his chin as if preparing for battle. His attorney began with a rehearsed assertiveness, laying out demands for a 50-50 split of all marital assets, including investment accounts, retirement funds, and home equity, plus $3,000 a month in spousal support, while Elias transitioned back to full-time employment. It was astonishing how confidently he announced these demands, as if he believed they were indisputable truths. Meanwhile, Elias didn't look at me, only at the stack of notes in front of him, his jaw set with a sense of entitlement he no longer tried to hide. My attorney didn't waver. She calmly opened a folder, smooth, deliberate, almost graceful, and slid a thick packet of documents across the table. The prenuptial agreement, she said, her tone polite but edged with precision, signed by both parties 6 years ago. The shift in the room was immediate. Elias's lawyer picked up the document with mild annoyance, flipping through it quickly at first, then slowing, then stopping altogether as the significance of its contents sank in. His brows began to knit together in confusion, then surprise, then something closer to alarm. He glanced at Elias. "You signed this." Elias frowned, with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Yes, years ago. It was just standard paperwork. Why?" My attorney answered before his lawyer could muster a response. "Because it protects Sandra's premarital inheritance entirely. It also protects her premarital business equity and the investment account derived from those funds." Elias's head jerked toward me as though I had physically struck him. What that investment account grew during our marriage. How can it be separate? Per the prenup, my attorney replied, "Growth of premarital assets remains separate property if kept in designated accounts," which it was. Silence fell over the room, heavy enough to feel physical. The mediator leaned slightly forward, as if bracing for impact. Elias's lawyer straightened the papers in front of him with a resigned sigh. "This agreement is extremely detailed," he said quietly. "There's no issue with its validity." My attorney continued, her tone calm and authoritative. "The protected assets total approximately $520,000. These are not considered marital property." Elias stared at me, betrayal contorting his expression. "You hid money from me." "I didn't hide anything," I said. "You simply never asked." He shook his head, stunned. "We're married. We were supposed to split everything." "We will," my attorney clarified. "The marital assets, which total approximately $260,000. The mediator added gently, "Your share would be half of that." Elias blinked rapidly, unable to process it. "That's nothing. How am I supposed to live off that?" My attorney pushed a second page forward. "We are offering a one-time spousal support payment of $18,000. This results in a total proposed settlement of $183,000. Elias looked from the paper to me, disbelief cracking through his voice. This is robbery." "No," I said quietly. "This is what you signed." His face darkened. "You trapped me." It would have been easy to react emotionally, but I didn't flinch. "You trapped yourself, Elias. You signed a legal document without reading it because you were too focused on picking out the right boutonniere and the perfect wedding playlist." My attorney placed a hand lightly on my folder, signaling it was time to leave. But before we could stand, Elias's lawyer, clearly rattled, requested a short recess. He led Elias out of the room and through the glass wall. I watched my husband pace back and forth, hands gesturing wildly as he attempted to rewrite the narrative into one where he was the victim. My attorney leaned toward me with a soft sigh. He's realizing that he's not walking away from this marriage with the lifestyle he expected. Their 15-minute discussion ended with both of them returning to the table, Elias red-eyed. And Hollow, his lawyer, resigned. "We reject the offer," the attorney said. "We'll be taking this to court." My attorney simply nodded. "Then we'll see you there." As I gathered my things, Elias finally spoke, his voice trembling with anger and desperation. "You're ruining my life, Sandra." I paused at the doorway but didn't turn back. "No. You ruined it when you told me I wasn't enough. I'm just finally listening." Then I walked out, leaving him to face the reality he had created. Court battles don't start in courtrooms. They start quietly in the spaces between anger and fear texts. After midnight, whispered complaints to relatives, half-truths posted online. Elias didn't wait long to escalate. Within 48 hours of mediation, his attorney filed a motion claiming the prenup was invalid due to emotional duress and lack of independent counsel. The accusation was absurd. We had signed that agreement years ago with careful documentation recommended by my uncle and reviewed by a lawyer Elias personally selected. But absurd accusations still demand legal responses, which meant more hours drafting statements, gathering evidence, and paying fees. My attorney warned me. This won't be a clean fight. He's angry, embarrassed, and cornered. Men in that position don't realize when they are burning their own futures. She wasn't wrong. The financial attacks came next. One afternoon, while I was reviewing quarterly reports at work, my bank sent an alert, attempted withdrawal exceeding daily limits. Elias had tried to empty the joint checking account. Fortunately, I had already moved my direct deposits and my half of the balance weeks earlier. He still managed to transfer out everything I intentionally left for him, including the extra few $100s I added, so he wouldn't struggle during the transition. The irony was predictable. His lawyer had to return the portion belonging to me after my attorney produced statements proving I hadn't touched his half. The next day, my boss called me into his office. I walked in bracing myself for bad news, wondering whether it was about our new software rollout. Instead, he gestured for me to take a seat. "Your husband contacted HR," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Multiple times." A hollow feeling tightened in my chest. What did he say? "He suggested you were unstable, disruptive, and possibly emotionally volatile at work." My boss gave me a sympathetic look. "We've known you for 8 years, Sandra." HR documented the calls and notified him that further contact would be considered harassment. "But I thought you should know." I nodded, holding my breath until he finished. "If you need time off or help documenting anything, just tell me. We're on your side." Walking back to my desk afterward, I felt a strange mixture of gratitude and humiliation. It was one thing to fight a failing marriage behind closed doors. It was something else entirely to watch him try to poison my livelihood. And still a part of me felt almost numb. Maybe this was what letting go really meant, expecting nothing from him, not even decency. Then came the social media posts. He never mentioned my name directly, but anyone who knew us would recognize the insinuations. Vague quotes about betrayal, greedy partners, abusive relationships, and wolves in sheep's clothing. The comments filled with sympathy from his friends, most of whom didn't know me, beyond a handshake at a barbecue. I didn't respond. I wouldn't have dignified it even if I had the energy. His mother, however, took a more direct approach. She called my mother my sister, even my father, who had met her exactly twice, and told each of them a different version of the story. In some versions, I had drained their accounts. In others, I had emotionally tormented Elias for years. In the most dramatic retellings, I had used marriage as a stepping stone to wealth. My sister called me after receiving one of those rants. "Is she completely unhinged?" she asked. "She's saying you hid money from him and controlled everything." I felt a bitter smile tug at my lips. That woman thinks breathing is a manipulative tactic if she doesn't approve of the air you breathe. Ignore her. But the most disturbing escalation happened 3 days before the hearing on the prenup motion. I woke up to a 6-page document from his lawyer claiming that Elias had been subjected to long-term emotional abuse by me and that the prenup was signed under psychological distress. I reread the document 3 times, my throat tightening. It was a surreal experience seeing myself described in ways that didn't resemble my character, my actions, or even my personality. My attorney was furious. "This is baseless. It's defamatory. They're hoping you'll panic." Don't. Still defending myself meant producing emails, screenshots, messages, and even mundane conversations to demonstrate the normalcy of our marriage. I sat at my kitchen table late into the night, reading through old texts, reliving moments I had long forgotten. There were birthday messages, inside jokes, weekend plans, silly arguments about what to eat for dinner. They weren't the evidence of an abusive marriage. They were the diary of a relationship that slowly eroded under pressure he created. Finally, the hearing arrived. The courtroom was quiet. The fluorescent lights strangely harsh against the polished wood. Elias's lawyer spoke passionately about power imbalances and coercion, but his words had the flimsy quality of someone trying to inflate a balloon with holes on every side. My attorney responded with methodical precision. She produced the email chain showing Elias had requested recommendations for a lawyer. Then she showed the invoice for the attorney he consulted, 3 full hours reviewing the prenup. Then came the signed document, acknowledging he had reviewed the agreement independently. And finally the pièce de résistance, the attorney himself testifying via Zoom, calmly explaining that Elias had understood every clause. It took the judge all of 10 minutes. "Motion denied," she said firmly. "The prenuptial agreement is valid." Elias's shoulders slumped like a collapsing tent. His lawyer looked defeated. His mother, seated behind him, inhaled sharply, as though she'd been personally insulted by the ruling. Outside the courtroom, Elias confronted me, his anger now stripped of the confidence he'd carried into mediation. "You planned this," he hissed. "You trapped me. You manipulated me into signing that." I met his eyes without flinching. "No. You signed something you didn't bother to read because you were distracted by wedding decorations. And now you're angry that your negligence has consequences." His mother stepped between us dramatically. "You'll regret this, Sandra. My son chose you when he could have had anyone. You should be grateful." I almost laughed. Grateful to be told I'm not enough. Grateful to be compared to every wealthy couple on Instagram. Grateful. To be treated like a stepping stone toward someone else's ego, no. I'm finally grateful that I'm walking away. His mother sputtered. Elias looked ready to explode. My attorney placed a hand on my arm. We're done here. As we walked to the parking lot, I heard Elias break down in sobs behind me. For a brief moment, a small, fragile part of me felt a flicker of sympathy. Then I remembered the coldness in his eyes the night he told me to step aside. The sympathy evaporated. The prenup ruling should have ended the worst of it, but endings rarely arrive, neatly tied with courtroom decisions. If anything, the judge's ruling pushed Elias into a new stage of desperation, one where logic no longer mattered and dignity became an optional accessory he discarded without hesitation. It started with the finances. While reviewing documents with my attorney, I came across a credit card statement I hadn't looked at in years. Elias and I shared a main joint account, but early in our marriage, I had added him as an authorized user on one of my personal credit cards, meant strictly for emergencies. In truth, I had forgotten the card even existed. The minimum payments were set on autopay from our joint account, and with our busy schedules, it simply slipped my mind. But the statement sitting in front of me told a very different story. $15,000 spent over the last 8 months. Not on groceries, not on home repairs, not even on anything remotely necessary. The charges read like a catalog of indulgence: $800, designer shoes, $1, $200 spa weekends, high-end restaurant tabs, boutique, clothing stores, and impulsive purchases at jewelry counters that made my stomach twist. While Elias lectured me about mediocre ambition, he'd been treating himself to luxuries behind my back using a card under my name. My attorney scanned the statement, eyebrows raised. He used this without your consent. He never mentioned it once, I said quietly. These weren't emergencies. He was living above our means and hiding it. She tapped her pen thoughtfully. This debt is marital because the card is yours. But considering he made every charge we can argue, he should be responsible for half of it. Essentially, his settlement would decrease by his share of the debt. A slow realization dawned over me. You're saying the $15,000 can be used to reduce what he gets. Exactly, she said. His portion would be $7,500. A strange, unfamiliar satisfaction curled inside me. Not spite, not cruelty, but justice. Fairness finally stepping into the room after months of being pushed aside. We filed the motion. Predictably, Elias and his attorney reacted like we'd declared war. The email exchange that followed was a masterpiece of indignation with his lawyer, accusing us of pettiness and vindictiveness, claiming the purchases were normal marital expenditures. My attorney responded succinctly. Designer handbags, luxury dinners, and spa retreats are not emergencies, nor were they disclosed. That week, Elias began appearing at places he knew I frequented, not to talk rationally, just to corner me emotionally. At the grocery store, he walked directly into my path, forcing me to pause. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded, his voice low but seething. "You're trying to destroy me financially." "You destroyed yourself," I said, moving past him. "I'm just cleaning up the mess." Another time at a cafe near my workplace, he approached my table so abruptly, the barista dropped a cup behind the counter. "You can't avoid me forever," Elias said, gripping the back of the chair across from me, as if he expected me to invite him to sit. "We were married 6 years, Sandra. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "It means enough to end it cleanly," I replied. "Stop showing up uninvited. All communication goes through attorneys." "You're being ridiculous," he snapped. "You're punishing me for one comment." I met his eyes steady and calm. It wasn't one comment. It was a truth you've been holding inside you for a long time, waiting for the moment you could weaponize it. You told me I wasn't enough. Believe it or not, I listened. His face contorted with an emotion I couldn't identify, anger twisted together with something almost like panic. "You're a bastard," he spat loud enough that half the cafe turned toward us. The barista quietly handed me a muffin on the house as Elias stormed out. But nothing compared to the debt hearing. The courtroom felt colder that day, as though the air itself sensed the bitterness settling in. Elias sat beside his attorney arms, crossed stiffly, while mine organized the credit card statements into a neat chronological stack. When the judge asked Elias's lawyer to explain the charges, he launched into an argument about normal marital expenses. My attorney waited patiently for him to finish before presenting the statements. "Your Honor," she began, "I would like to highlight a few examples of what Mr. Hale considers normal marital expenses." She read aloud charges from luxury boutiques, $400 dinners, $1, $200, spa packages, and impulsive high-end purchases. These were not agreed upon, disclosed, or used for household necessities. They were discretionary, personal indulgences. The judge turned to me. Ms. Baker, were you aware of these expenditures? No, Your Honor, I said. I added him to the card years ago for emergencies and forgot about it. The payments were automated, so I had no idea he had been using it. And you're requesting that he be responsible for half of the debt? Yes. Since he made all the charges, I believe it's fair he shares responsibility. The judge nodded and looked at Elias's lawyer. Does your client dispute making these charges? There was a moment of hesitation before the lawyer said quietly, no. Then half the debt, $7,500, will be deducted from his settlement. The blow landed visibly. Elias's mouth fell open. This is theft, he shouted. She's stealing from me. Sit down, the judge said firmly, eyes narrowing, or I will hold you in contempt. He sat, chest rising and falling with angry, uneven breaths. When the final numbers were announced, his settlement reduced from approximately $165,000 to $157,500. Elias looked as though the ground had dropped from beneath him. It wasn't just the money, it was the symbolism. He had built his self-worth on the illusion of superiority, and now he was leaving the marriage with far less than he'd expected. As we exited the courthouse, he followed me into the hallway. You'll regret every part of this, he hissed. You think you've won, but you haven't. I turned to face him, fully feeling a calm I hadn't felt in months. There is no winning here, Elias. There's only surviving a life with you, and finally stepping into one without you. His expression flickered defiance, then sadness, then something hollow. I walked past him and didn't look back. The divorce was no longer a battle. It was an ending he couldn't escape. The final hearing arrived on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of morning where the sky felt too heavy for daylight. I sat alone at the plaintiff's table, hands folded neatly, listening to the shuffle of papers and muted whispers bouncing off the courtroom walls. My attorney leaned toward me once to say, "This will be quick." But even her reassurance carried the fatigue of months of conflict. Elias arrived minutes later looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The expensive jacket he wore hung awkwardly on him like he'd lost weight too quickly, or bought a size he couldn't grow into. His mother trailed behind him, eyes sharp with suspicion, as if she believed she was walking into an ambush rather than a legal proceeding. The judge entered, and everyone rose. When we sat again, Elias's attorney made one final attempt to paint him as a victim, this time focusing on the narrative that Elias had sacrificed his career for our marriage and therefore deserved additional compensation. The judge skimmed the documents in front of her, unimpressed. According to the employment history provided, she said Mr. Hale worked part-time retail before and during the marriage. There is no evidence of a professional career abandoned or interrupted. Elias shifted in his seat. I watched the back of his neck flush a deep red, the same shade it used to turn whenever he was embarrassed, but unwilling to admit fault. The judge continued, her tone decisive and unyielding. The prenuptial agreement stands. The calculated settlement of $157,500 stands. Divorce is granted. The finality of the words echoed through the room. Elias inhaled sharply as if bracing for impact, and his mother muttered, "Ridiculous," under her breath. My attorney began packing our folders, and I felt a softness settle over me. Not joy, not triumph, just closure. Elias rose and approached me before I could leave the courtroom. His eyes glistened, though whether from anger or grief, I couldn't tell. "You didn't have to do this," he whispered. "I would have come around. You never gave me a chance." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the man I married, but the man he had become, one shaped by comparison, envy, and entitlement, so deeply ingrained he no longer recognized it. "I gave you 6 years of chances," I said calmly. "The last one ended the moment you told me to step aside so you could find someone richer." He shook his head. "I didn't mean it. You know I didn't." "Intent doesn't erase truth," I replied. "And the truth is, you believed it. That's enough." His mother stepped between us, then jabbing a finger toward me. "You ruined his life." My attorney appeared at my side, her presence a wall I didn't need but appreciated. "Ma'am," she said firmly, "further confrontation is inappropriate. Please step away." I turned without another word and walked out of the courthouse, feeling the weight of the entire ordeal finally loosen its grip. I moved into a downtown apartment 2 weeks later, half the size of the home Elias and I shared, but light streamed through the living room windows in a way that made the space feel open, airy, honest. I bought new curtains, rearranged the furniture 3 times, and planted small herbs in the kitchen windowsill: basil, thyme, rosemary. It became a ritual I didn't know I needed, waking up to the scent of fresh soil and sunlight. I didn't want the house we'd lived in together. Every room carried echoes of his discontent, the way he'd compared our kitchen to Brian's, the way he'd sighed. When the water pressure in the shower wasn't spa quality, the way he'd complained the bedroom felt cramped compared to the luxury suites his friends posted online. Selling it felt like shedding a skin that no longer fit. Work stabilized too. My boss and team treated me with a quiet, constant compassion that made me grateful in ways I couldn't articulate. For the first time in months, I felt like I was no longer fighting for air. 3 months after the divorce, I ran into Elias's sister at a restaurant. She pretended not to see me, turning her head so sharply it reminded me of a startled bird. One of the women at her table, though, approached me as I was paying my bill. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I know who you are. I just wanted to tell you. Good for you. He and his family. They're a lot." She hesitated before adding, "His sister is just like him." It wasn't the validation I needed, but it was the validation I got, and it felt strangely grounding. I learned through mutual acquaintances that Elias had moved back in with his mother. He was working full-time at the boutique, now the same one he used to mock for being temporary. Rumor had it he was dating someone new. A woman he boasted came from money. "Good luck to him," one friend said with a shrug. "He'll need it." Another remarked that he still talked about the divorce, constantly insisting he'd been blindsided and financially gutted. I didn't bother correcting the story. People believe the version that makes them comfortable. Let him carry whatever narrative helps him feel whole. One evening, I received a final text message from an unknown number. I knew immediately who it was. His mother. "You ruined his life. He's struggling because of you. I hope you're happy." I stared at the message for a long moment before typing a response. He told me to step aside so he could find someone who could afford him. I stepped aside. He should be thanking me. I blocked the number after hitting send. It was the last thread connecting me to their world and cutting. It felt like exhaling for the first time in a year. Life didn't transform overnight. It didn't become a parade of victories or sudden joys, but it became mine again. I relearned small pleasures, quiet mornings, long walks, nights without conflict or comparison. I relearned my own worth. Sometimes people imagine divorce as a failure. I used to believe that too. But now I understand something far more important. Failure wasn't leaving. Failure would have been staying with a man who measured love by bank statements and self-worth by other people's luxuries. If I gained anything from those difficult months, it was clarity about myself, about what I deserve, and about what I will never allow again. And if there is one truth I want to leave you with, it is this. When someone shows you who you are in their eyes, believe them. Then decide courageously to walk toward the life you deserve. My name is Kelly George, and I'm 36 years old. If you had asked me at any point in my life what the worst day I'd ever experienced was, I probably would have chosen something stressful but ordinary, a failed project at work, a painful breakup in my 20s, or the day I sprained my ankle, hiking a trail I had no business climbing. But none of those moments, not even combined, come close to the Tuesday my wife vanished without a trace. Roger, my wife of 8 years, is 34. That morning she left for work the same way she always did, moving through the kitchen with quiet efficiency. She poured her coffee, grabbed her neatly packed lunch, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "See you tonight." There was nothing unusual in her tone, no tension, no hesitation. It was a normal morning in every possible way until it wasn't, because that night she never came home, and there were no calls, no texts, no signs that she was safe or intentionally away, just silence. The first night I tried not to panic. Roger occasionally went out with coworkers from her pharmaceutical sales team. Sometimes their dinners turned into late-night drinks, and she'd come home a little tipsy and exhausted. Even then, she always sent a quick message letting me know. That night, my phone stayed painfully still. By 2 a.m, after calling her twice with no response, the worry began to sink into my bones. By 4, the house felt unbearably empty. I called her best friend, nothing. Then I called her sister, who sounded genuinely surprised that Roger wasn't home. She had no idea where Roger was and no explanation to offer. By the next day, I felt helpless enough to file a missing person report. The officer behind the desk listened sympathetically, but ultimately gave me the answer I dreaded: adults are allowed to disappear. There were no signs of foul play. Her phone was active, her credit cards weren't being misused, and from the outside it looked like she had simply stepped away from her life by choice. I remember staring at him and telling him, "She didn't tell me she was leaving." He shrugged and asked almost gently if we were fighting. We weren't. That was the part I couldn't wrap my mind around. Our lives had become routine, maybe even predictable, but certainly not volatile enough to justify this. Days 3 and 4 were excruciating. Roger's phone started going straight to voicemail. Her sister finally admitted she'd received a single text: "I'm fine. Need time." No elaboration, no reassurance for me. Just a message to her sister, not to her wife. Her parents, on the other hand, called me in a frenzy. They shouted, accused, demanded answers I didn't have. They were terrified and wanted an easy target, and I was the closest one available. At home, her absence took on a physical weight. Her shoes were still by the door, her coffee mug still in the sink, her favorite cardigan draped over the back of our living room chair. Every room felt like a ghost of her, untouched, frozen in time, mocking me with the illusion of normalcy. By late afternoon on day 4, my anxiety had twisted into something sharper, an exhausted, nauseous sort of desperation. I couldn't just sit back and wait anymore. That was when I called a private investigator. A colleague of mine had once hired a man named Rye for a workers' comp issue, and she'd said he was efficient, discreet, and brutally honest. When I explained the situation to him over the phone, he summarized it succinctly. "Your wife is missing, but she told her family she's fine, and you want to know where she is." I swallowed hard and admitted, "I want to know what the hell is happening." He didn't waste time. He told me he would begin immediately tracking her phone's public location history, checking nearby hotels, pulling anything he could legally access. I felt disgusted with myself for involving someone else in our marriage, but I also felt a terrible relief. I couldn't keep waiting for Roger to walk through the door with an explanation I no longer believed she had. On day 5 Friday evening, around 8 o'clock, I was sitting on the couch in sweatpants, surrounded by half-eaten pizza and the mess of 5 days of panic when I heard the front door unlock. Not a knock. Not a hesitant turn of the handle. Roger used her key like she was coming home from an ordinary shift. I sat up straight as she stepped inside, dragging a suitcase behind her. Her hair was freshly styled, her clothes crisp, her face relaxed. She looked like she had spent the week at a spa instead of disappearing off the face of the earth. She glanced at me with an almost bored expression and said, "Hey," as if she'd just run out to buy groceries. I asked her where she had been. My voice was shaky, but I kept my tone controlled. Roger rolled her eyes at me. Her wife, who had been sick with worry for 5 days and said she needed space. She said adults were allowed to take time for themselves. She said she didn't owe me a detailed itinerary of her movements. She said I was being dramatic for involving the police. I reminded her that I had filed a missing person report, that her parents thought something had happened to her, that her complete silence had led everyone who loved her to assume the worst. She brushed it all off, calmly telling me she had texted her sister as if that justified everything. She turned away from me, opened the fridge, grabbed a water bottle, and leaned on the counter like she was tired of arguing about something trivial. That was when her tone shifted. She told me she needed a break from us, that she felt suffocated, that I was always hovering. Her confident expression, her casual dismissal of my fear, it was as if she had rehearsed this moment. Something inside me hardened. I told her she was right. She didn't owe me answers. She looked relieved when I said it, actually relieved. Even smiled a little, believing the conversation was ending there. I walked to the home office, retrieved the manila folder that Rye had couriered 2 hours earlier, and handed it to her. Roger frowned, confused. I told her they were divorce papers. I told her she had been served. Her confusion turned to shock, then panic. Before she could sputter out a denial, I pulled out the hotel receipts. Courtyard Hotel, 5 nights, 1 king bed, 2 guests registered under her name. Her face drained of color as she flipped through the contents of the folder. Time-stamped photos showing her with a man I didn't recognize entering the hotel. Together, leaving together, repeating the pattern for 5 consecutive days. While she trembled, trying to assemble an explanation, I simply stood there. For the first time since Tuesday morning, the fear shifted off my shoulders, and it landed squarely onto hers. Roger's shock lasted only a few seconds before it shifted into something far more familiar performance. Her eyes widened, her breath trembled, her hands began to shake in calculated rhythm. It was the same look she used on hotel clerks when her room wasn't ready, or when a restaurant forgot her reservation, an expression that blended indignation with injured innocence. She stammered out that I had misunderstood everything, that the hotel stay was not what it looked like, that she had been stressed and confused and had made a mistake. The word mistake hung in the air like she expected it to unravel 5 days of betrayal into something small. But I didn't interrupt. I let her talk, watching the gears in her mind turn as she scrambled for a version of events she could live with. When she realized I wasn't reaching for her or offering any emotional lifeline, Roger shifted tactics. Her voice softened, and tears began to spill, not the raw, broken kind, but the practiced ones she used when she needed sympathy. She said she didn't know what she was thinking, that work had been overwhelming, that she hadn't felt appreciated, that the man in the photos didn't mean anything. She begged me to talk it through, to give her a chance to explain everything in context. But there was no context that could justify 5 consecutive nights at a hotel with another person. I stayed calm, and that seemed to unsettle her more than if I had yelled. She accused me of being cold, of reacting too harshly, of looking for reasons to abandon our marriage instead of save it. I reminded her that she was the one who had abandoned it. She didn't like that answer. Within minutes, the tears dried up and were replaced by anger. "You're going to regret this," she hissed, her voice sharpening. "You think you can just ambush me with papers like I'm some criminal? You're destroying everything over something that didn't even matter." I didn't say anything in response. There was nothing left to say. That night she stayed in the guest room with the door shut, crying loudly enough for me to hear through the walls. I didn't go to her. I couldn't. The shock had worn off, and in its place was a heavy, exhausted clarity. The next morning, while I was making coffee, Roger came out of the guest room with eyes that were puffy but defiant. She announced she had spoken to a lawyer. According to him, she said I had no right to kick her out of her home or enforce any sort of deadline for her to leave the house. She presented this information like she was delivering a checkmate. I calmly told her that my lawyer disagreed. When I added that the house was legally mine, purchased before our marriage, and kept in my name, her expression faltered. It was the first time she seemed to realize that the stability she had always taken for granted was not hers to weaponize. She stormed out without another word. For a little while, there was peace, or rather silence. I couldn't call it peace when the entire situation hovered over me like a storm cloud, but the house felt strange and still without her presence. I worked, I slept poorly, I waited for the next blow. It came on Monday morning, when Roger's best friend Layla showed up unannounced. She was leaning against my front door when I pulled into the driveway after leaving the office early. I could tell from the tightness in her jaw what kind of conversation she had come to initiate. "We need to talk," she said the moment I stepped out of my car. "No," I replied evenly, "we don't." But Layla pushed forward anyway. She claimed Roger was devastated, that she was in a fragile place, that throwing 8 years away over a moment of weakness was cruel. She insisted Roger had been emotionally neglected and that I had failed to support her during one of the hardest periods of her life. What struck me most wasn't the accusation, it was how confidently Layla spoke about a marriage she'd never been inside of. Roger, in less than a week, had already rewritten the narrative to cast herself as the victim, and her friends, loyal in the way that required no fact-checking, had embraced it without hesitation. I told Layla she didn't understand what was actually happening. I told her that Roger had not made a single mistake. She had made a series of choices over 5 days with intention and consistency. Layla rolled her eyes at the word choice, muttered something about people making bad decisions under pressure, and argued that the man Roger had met was simply someone who made her feel seen. It was astonishing how easily other people excused deliberate betrayal when it wasn't their heart on the table. Eventually realizing she wouldn't sway me, Layla tried a parting shot. "You know, Kelly, maybe you were too cold. Maybe she needed something you couldn't give. Maybe that's why she looked somewhere else." I simply nodded toward my front door. "Great. Then she can stay with him permanently." That ended the conversation. Layla left in a huff, muttering that Roger deserved someone more understanding. That same week, I received a call from a blocked number. Normally, I ignore them, but in a moment of reflex or morbid curiosity, I answered. A male voice said, "Is this her wife?" I paused. "Who is this?" "It's him," he said awkwardly. "Your wife's friend. Her affair partner. Of all the absurd moments in the past week, that one still feels unreal. He apologized not for the affair, but for the way things happened, as if he were offering condolences for a delayed package. He claimed Roger told him our marriage was practically over, that we were growing apart, that she wasn't happy. I asked if she had also mentioned we were still married, sharing a home, and eating dinner together as recently as the morning she vanished. There was a long silence before he admitted she had said things were complicated. Then he revealed that Roger was staying with him now. The simplicity of his admission hit me harder than anything else. Not emotionally, but strategically. Roger wasn't just guilty of adultery, she had immediately moved in with the affair partner. My lawyer would want to know. When I ended the call, I felt something I hadn't felt since the nightmare began solid ground under my feet. Roger had been rewriting reality for everyone around her, but the truth still existed, and now I had a clear path forward. The narratives were spinning, but I wasn't getting caught in them. The day after I learned Roger had already moved in with the affair partner, I met with my lawyer, Ms. Rodriguez. She was a sharp, composed woman in her mid-40s, with an expression that never revealed more than she intended. When I walked into her office, she gestured for me to sit and immediately got down to business. She had already reviewed the PI's evidence, the hotel receipts, and the preliminary divorce filing. She didn't waste time with sympathy. Instead, she opened her notebook and explained that Roger had retained a lawyer known for being ambitious, her polite way of saying aggressive. He's planning to argue you're being vindictive, she said, tapping her pen lightly. He's claiming you overreacted to a single lapse in judgment caused by emotional distress. He wants temporary spousal support, half the house value, and is prepared to dispute the adultery. I actually laughed, not out of amusement, but out of disbelief. A single lapse in judgment. She planned the hotel stay 3 days in advance. She was gone for 5. Ms. Rodriguez nodded. We'll use that. It disproves impulsivity and supports premeditation. I appreciated her precision. She didn't sugarcoat anything, which was exactly what I needed. She laid out the strategy documentation, strict communication handled only by lawyers, zero emotional engagement with Roger or anyone connected to her. She warned me that Roger's team would try to provoke reactions, emotional responses, impulsive messages, anything that could be twisted into ammunition. Stay steady, she said, and tell me immediately if her family or friends escalate. Escalate was an understatement. 2 days later, Roger's father showed up at my workplace. He walked straight into the lobby demanding to speak with me. My receptionist looked rattled when she called back to my office. I stepped out, greeted him stiffly, and led him outside so my coworkers wouldn't have to witness whatever was about to unfold. He didn't bother with pleasantries. You need to drop this divorce, he said, breathing heavily, like he had rehearsed the line during the drive. You're making a huge mistake. No, I answered calmly. Roger made the mistake. He clenched his jaw and went on about how long marriages required forgiveness, how Roger had been under pressure and wasn't thinking clearly, how adults sometimes drift and find their way back. It was astonishing listening to him speak about betrayal like it was a misplaced library book. When I didn't budge, he pivoted. Look, Kelly, if you push this, it's going to get ugly. We'll fight you for the house, your retirement, everything. Years of court battles. Is that really what you want? The threat was so transparent, it was almost insulting. I told him the truth. I wasn't dropping anything. His expression hardened immediately. Then you're going to lose more than a wife. He walked away without saying goodbye. I stood outside for a moment, letting the anger simmer until it cooled enough for me to function. The fact that Roger had weaponized her family so efficiently was almost impressive. They had accepted her version of the story without question, one where she was a distressed woman smothered by a cold, unforgiving spouse, rather than someone who had voluntarily checked into a hotel with another person for nearly a week. When I returned inside, my boss approached me. He had seen Roger's father leaving and asked if everything was all right. I gave him a short explanation, personal matter, nothing for the company to worry about. He nodded, but his eyes said he was concerned. It was another reminder that Roger's chaos didn't stay in neat boundaries. It spread into every part of my life. After work, I called Ms. Rodriguez to tell her what happened. She listened carefully, then told me to write down every detail while it was fresh. If he appears at your workplace again, she said, we'll file for a restraining order. Document everything. I followed her instructions immediately. That weekend, the next escalation came. Roger tried to get into the house. I had changed the locks the day after she moved out. Ms. Rodriguez recommended it to protect my property, but Roger acted like I had committed a crime. She pounded on the front door Saturday morning until I opened it with the chain still on. She demanded to come in to retrieve her things. I told her she needed to schedule it through her lawyer. She insisted that was ridiculous, that she had every right to access the house. I repeated myself, schedule it through legal channels. Her frustration built until she reached for the door handle and tried to push it open, the chain rattling violently. She threatened to call the police. I told her she should. I knew exactly how that would play out. 20 minutes later, officers arrived. They listened to both sides, reviewed the divorce paperwork, confirmed she was no longer living there, and informed her that this was a civil matter to be handled through attorneys. Roger's anger surged into a public scene, calling the situation unfair, accusing me of stealing her belongings, yelling loudly enough for neighbors to peek out their windows. The officers warned her to calm down or leave. She eventually stormed off, shouting, "You're going to pay for this," before speeding away. That night, I sat in the quiet living room and wondered how someone could transform this quickly. Not just into someone unfaithful, but into someone vindictive, reckless, and unrecognizable. Another blow came a few days later. A call from the bank informed me someone had attempted to withdraw funds from our old joint account, one I had already placed a hold on after filing. The teller told me the system had blocked the transaction per my instructions. When I asked who attempted the withdrawal, they said, "Your wife." Roger was trying to drain accounts behind the scenes while claiming to the court that she was financially stranded. I took a deep breath and added that information to the growing pile of documented incidents. Then came the public smear campaign. Roger's sister began posting vague, melodramatic messages online, cryptic references to escaping toxicity and finally being safe. She never named me, but everyone understood the implication. Friends who didn't know the full story sent me sympathetic texts. Some believed Roger, some didn't. My actual circle, those who knew me well, saw through her performance immediately and offered quiet, steady support. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched and judged by people who had no idea what had really happened inside our marriage. Roger wasn't just rewriting our story, she was rewriting me. The waiting for the court date stretched on like a taut string. 6 weeks felt both too long and not long enough. I spent the time gathering documents, forwarding every new development to Ms. Rodriguez, recording each instance of harassment, and trying to preserve enough mental energy to function at work. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. It was a war, a strategic one, a psychological one, a legal one. And Roger was willing to scorch everything to win the narrative. But I had the truth, evidence, stability, and a lawyer who didn't flinch. The storm was still building, and the courtroom was waiting. The morning of the hearing felt strangely quiet, as if the world around me had lowered its volume to prepare for whatever would unfold. I woke before my alarm, not from nerves exactly, but from a kind of clarity that had only grown sharper over the past 6 weeks. This wasn't about salvaging anything anymore, not the marriage, not the version of Roger I used to know, not the life we had built. This was about truth consequences and closing a door that had been rotting long before it finally fell off its hinges. I arrived at the courthouse early and found Ms. Rodriguez already waiting in the hallway, flipping through her neatly organized binder. She gave me a curt nod, her version of reassurance. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded back. There wasn't anything left to prepare for. When Roger and her lawyer arrived, it was like watching actors step onto a stage. Roger wore a soft, pale-colored blouse, her hair styled deliberately to make her appear fragile, approachable, vulnerable. It was a calculated costume, and the bitter irony was that it probably worked on everyone who didn't know her. Her lawyer, an overly confident man in a sleek suit, carried himself like he was about to deliver a winning monologue. They avoided looking at me at first, which suited me fine. Inside the courtroom, the judge, a composed woman with sharp eyes, reviewed the documents before beginning. Roger's lawyer wasted no time launching into his narrative. According to him, Roger had been emotionally distressed, overwhelmed by the pressures of work and marriage, and had suffered a temporary mental health break that led her to make a regrettable but isolated mistake. He claimed she felt controlled, smothered, unsupported. He described her as a woman pushed past her limits by a cold, unyielding spouse. Listening to him rewrite my entire marriage in front of me was surreal. It was like hearing someone tell a story about strangers, except the stranger he was painting, as the villain was me. Ms. Rodriguez didn't react outwardly. She simply took notes and waited. When it was her turn, she began with facts, not emotion. The 5 days of disappearance, the lack of communication, the single text to a family member, and the immediate return home with no sign of distress. She emphasized the premeditated nature of the hotel stay, reserved 3 days in advance. She listed the documented receipts, the surveillance timestamps, the confirmation that there were meals for 2 champagne, and a consistent pattern of shared nights. Roger shifted in her seat the moment the word premeditated left my lawyer's mouth. Ms. Rodriguez then addressed the move-in with the affair partner. The judge lifted her eyebrows slightly at that point, an expression that said she had heard enough excuses in her career to know what this meant. Premeditation, prolonged contact, immediate cohabitation, none of it aligned with the narrative of a temporary crisis. Finally, the judge turned to Roger and asked directly, "Did you inform your spouse you were leaving for 5 days?" Roger hesitated. "No, Your Honor." "Did you communicate with her at all during those 5 days?" "I texted my sister." "But not your wife?" A pause. "No." "And you were staying at a hotel with another person during this time?" Roger's lawyer jumped in, attempting to intercept with the mental health argument again, but the judge stopped him with a raised hand. "Counsel, I understand your client was under stress, but the evidence here contradicts the idea of impulsive behavior. The hotel reservation was made 3 days in advance. That suggests intention, not crisis." Roger stared straight ahead. She didn't look at me once. What surprised me most wasn't the judge's tone. It was how small Roger looked when confronted with the truth, as though the weight of the performance she had been carrying finally collapsed under scrutiny. Her carefully curated fragility dissolved the moment reality entered the conversation, and for the first time since she walked back into our home weeks ago, she seemed genuinely unprepared. The judge announced the ruling with clear, measured authority. The divorce was granted on the grounds of adultery. The house purchased before the marriage and solely in my name would remain mine. Roger would not receive spousal support. She was employed full-time, had steady raises throughout our marriage, and had moved in with another partner who was now contributing to her living situation. As for marital assets, she would receive a percentage of the joint retirement contributions made during the marriage and half of what little remained in the joint savings account. Ms. Rodriguez had prepared me for that. It was unavoidable under state law, but it was minimal compared to what Roger had been demanding. The moment Roger realized she wasn't getting the house, her jaw tightened. When spousal support was denied, her face fell completely. Her lawyer attempted one last argument about emotional rehabilitation and rebuilding her life, but the judge shut it down with a reminder that Roger's choices had consequences, and the court would not redistribute property to compensate for them. The hearing ended. The judge dismissed us with a nod. It was astonishing how quiet the room seemed after the decision was made, as if all the tension had been vacuumed out at once. Outside the courthouse, Roger's mother confronted me almost immediately. She shouted accusations, called me heartless, accused me of destroying her daughter's life. Her voice echoed down the steps, drawing the attention of people who had nothing to do with our case. Ms. Rodriguez stepped between us firmly and told her to walk away or face legal consequences for harassment. Roger's mother backed up but continued cursing under her breath as she followed Roger toward the parking lot. Her father didn't say anything to me at all. He just stared with an expression that mixed disappointment with resentment before turning away. I stood there for a few seconds after they left, letting the sun hit my face, breathing deeply. It wasn't joy I felt, or triumph, just something like release. A pressure that had been building for months suddenly lifted, leaving behind an unexpected quiet. When I finally drove home, unlocking the door to my house, a strange stillness greeted me. The kind that doesn't make a room feel empty, but safe. I set my keys on the counter, sank into the new couch I'd bought after all this began, and just sat there letting the silence surround me. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't bracing myself for another explosion, another accusation, another upheaval. It was over. But endings, even necessary ones, leave their own kind of echo. And I still had to figure out what to do with the life that was finally mercifully mine again. The weeks after the divorce felt strange in a way I didn't expect. I had imagined that once the judge signed the papers and the arguments ended, I'd be flooded with relief, an exhale big enough to quiet every chaotic thought that had consumed me since the day Roger vanished. Instead, what I felt was quieter and harder to define, a kind of emotional aftershock that came in small waves. Not sadness, not regret, but something like recalibration. My life had been cracked open, and I was slowly learning the shape of the space that remained. Word reached me through mutual acquaintances that Roger hadn't stayed long with the affair partner. Less than 2 months after the court ruling, he asked her to leave. From what I heard, he wasn't prepared for a full-time relationship and certainly not one with someone carrying the weight of a messy divorce. Roger, who had once glowed with self-assurance as she walked into our house after 5 unexplained days away, apparently struggled to find stable ground. She moved back in with her parents, returning to the same bedroom she'd grown up in. She kept her job, but coworkers whispered she seemed subdued, frustrated, convinced the world had wronged her. Friends told me she'd been saying the divorce was unfair, that I had punished her too severely for a moment of weakness. She left out the part where the hotel reservation was made days in advance. She left out the repeated nights with another person. She left out the attempt to drain the joint account. In Roger's story, she was the woman who made a tiny mistake and was destroyed by a cold-hearted wife with no compassion. I used to worry what people thought about me, but after everything that happened, it felt irrel Rogert. People who wanted the truth already knew it. Those who chose her story were never mine to keep. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding, not the marriage, obviously, but the life that had been overshadowed by Roger's betrayal. The first step was my home. It had taken on a strange heaviness during the divorce, like every piece of furniture held some echo of an argument or a moment where I had questioned my own sanity. So I began to change the space. Not dramatically, just reshaping it into something that reflected me rather than us. I bought a new couch, soft and modern, nothing like the tufted gray one Roger had chosen because it photographed well for guests. I replaced the bedroom set with something warmer, something I actually wanted. I repainted the walls in the office and threw out stacks of old papers we'd kept for no real reason. I donated things Roger left behind without sentimental value, decorations, blankets, mugs, trinkets she collected but never really used. With every change, the house felt lighter, as if the air itself was clearing. Work, too, became steadier. I threw myself into projects partly out of necessity, partly because it felt good to inhabit a space where competence was recognized rather than twisted into something controlling or cold. A month after the final court ruling, my supervisor called me in and offered a promotion, something we'd been discussing even before the chaos began. Better pay, more responsibility, and the validation that I hadn't lost myself even when it felt like I had been fighting to prove my own sanity. My friends were another unexpected blessing. The ones who stayed the real ones, didn't push, didn't ask for details, didn't try to dissect the wreckage. They just showed up. Movie nights, hikes, late-night diners, simple conversations that felt like oxygen. Losing the people who believed Roger's version of events hurt, but what remained after their absence was a circle of loyalty I didn't take for granted. Therapy also became a regular part of my week. I started going a few weeks into the divorce to help me process the whirlwind of betrayal and gaslighting. My therapist told me I was doing better than most people would in my situation, that I seemed grounded despite everything. I didn't feel grounded, not exactly. But I understood myself better in those sessions, understood the quiet habits I'd formed to keep peace, the ways I'd minimize my own needs without noticing the emotional exhaustion I mistook for stability. I wasn't ready to date again. I didn't even consider it. Not because of bitterness, but because my heart needed space to breathe without someone else's expectations wrapped around it. The trust required for a relationship was something I'd need time to rebuild carefully and honestly, not out of fear of being alone. A month after the divorce, Roger sent a message. Not directly, it came through her sister, who sent a long, spiraling text about forgiveness, second chances, emotional healing, how love was bigger than mistakes. I stared at the message for a long time without feeling anything except a gentle, conclusive certainty. I didn't reply. I forwarded it to Ms. Rodriguez for documentation, then deleted it. Forgiveness isn't the same as returning to someone, and some doors once closed stay closed for good reason. One evening, sitting alone on my new couch, I looked around the living room. Warm lighting, quiet music in the background, soft shadows against freshly painted walls. The air felt calm in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Not the uneasy calm that comes from holding your breath during tension, but the real kind, the kind that lets your shoulders drop and your mind unclench. I realized then that Roger was no longer the center of my story, not the villain, not the wound, not the ghost hovering in every corner of my thoughts. She was simply gone. A person who had once been part of my life, who showed me clearly who she was and who I finally believed. What stayed was me, my home, my peace, my clarity. No dramatic revenge. No final confrontation. Just consequences, hers and mine. She made choices that fractured our marriage beyond repair. I made choices that protected what remained of my life. If there was a lesson in any of it, it was this. When someone walks out of your life, don't chase them into the darkness. Let them go. Turn toward the light you can control. I don't hate her. I don't love her. I don't resent her. She's simply someone I used to know, someone who taught me more about self-respect than I ever expected to learn through pain. The chapter closed. Cleanly. Finally. And now, for the first time in years, I get to decide what comes next.